Hey, what's up, everyone? Sam Shaw here, founder of Wall Street Mastermind. I'm back today with another client interview for you guys. Today, I'm excited to have Evan on here with us. Evan actually finished the recruiting process a while ago, but we just never had the opportunity to catch up until now. And so I'm glad to have him on. I'm excited to catch up with him, but also, have him just shed some light on the recruiting process for you guys and just give you some advice on kind of what worked and what didn't work for him, and hopefully you guys can benefit from this interview. So Evan, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Sam.
Absolutely. So to start, I think what would be helpful for everyone is if you just maybe gave a quick introduction around kind of who you are and things like that, and then we can kind of dive into the questions.
Sure, sounds good. So, hey everyone, I'm Evan. I'm currently right now a senior at Penn. I'm studying finance and strategic management. And I, just full disclosure, didn't really have too much experience in investment banking. My parents, although my dad does work in quant finance, I personally didn't really, have anyone that was, very helpful in the process for me to do investment banking. And I'm really glad to have had Wall Street Mastermind to help me throughout the process. And, more than excited to share some helpful tips to you guys today.
Awesome. It's awesome. So let's go back to the beginning, man. When did you kind of start recruiting for banking or think about banking? Because obviously you, like you mentioned, you go to Penn. Mm-hmm. Everybody at Penn is trying to get into banking, right? Mm-hmm. So you probably heard about banking, pretty early on, freshman year, I'm guessing, maybe even. Like, when did you seriously start considering, like, hey, this is the career path that I would like to pursue?
Yeah, no, I mean, my story is a little bit unique, I guess, because for me personally, like, yes, I did have a great network at Penn and a lot of alumni and people to kind of refer to talk about investment banking and consider the different kind of trajectories of investment banking. But for me, I know I felt a little bit lost, especially I want to say closer to my sophomore year. I was still really unsure if I wanted to do consulting or investment banking or even consider a marketing path. I actually did a marketing internship my freshman summer abroad. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was something I wanted to pursue, but I guess like the pressure of being at Penn with a lot of people that were very finance oriented, that kind of sucked me in early on, and I really thought that I just wanted to give it a chance and really explore it. So I wouldn't say that even though I had it on my plate and it was in the back of my head, I definitely wouldn't say I started very early, and I really didn't seriously consider it until probably later into my sophomore year, maybe middle and even closer to the end, to really actually consider investment banking and begin reaching out to people.
Yeah. Got it. Okay, so that's probably relatively late compared to a lot of your peers at Penn who probably coming into Penn, they already knew they wanted to do banking, and then like first semester freshman year, they're doing all sorts of finance internships and joining finance clubs and WITG and this and that. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, so you decided towards the end of sophomore year, and then like what did you do at that point? Like once you decided, you're like, hey, this is something I want to try out. What was your approach at that time? Because I don't think it's not like you just decided you want to go into banking and you came to Wall Street Mastermind right away, right? Like you probably try to do a bunch of stuff on your own. So like, what was that like?
Yeah, I guess for me it was a little bit, I want to say stressful because it was late into my sophomore year, maybe around February, March, and I was actually scrambling to find something to do my sophomore year. So for my sophomore internship, and just, randomly applying to all those PE and small buy-side shops, like as one does their sophomore year. So I actually wasn't really focused on, my junior summer, the summer that everyone knows, actually matters and really hopefully turns into, your full-time job post-graduation. So I was really focused on finding my sophomore internship and kind of put junior internship recruiting, on hold, as you might say. So I wasn't really focused on junior recruiting, at the end of my sophomore year. But I want to say once I found an internship for my sophomore year around late March, beginning of April, I shifted gears and began to really start looking around my school's career service center, which was Handshake, for events that had to do with investment banking, recruiting nights, networking events. That was probably my very first kind of like deep dive into this, and just at least figuring out like, okay, I know these are events, these are happening on campus or even virtually. I have to be going to these. I have to be kind of at least showing my face somewhere. So I think that was probably my first step, and obviously a little bit probably late to the game, considering this is only 1.5, 2 years ago. But I want to say that was my first step, doing a deep dive into IB recruiting.
Got it. Got it. And what would you say were some of your biggest challenges at the time in terms of, because there's obviously a lot of moving parts in banking and recruiting, right? Like, you got to have a good resume. You got to network with bankers and try to get referrals, right? You got to know your technical questions. You got to know how to answer the behaviors. Like, what were the parts that you kind of found yourself kind of struggling with as you were going through this process?
If I'm being honest, maybe a little bit of everything. I think one thing I will say, I think I felt pretty confident in maybe my resume, just because, I had a great alumni network. In my business fraternity, we had like a lot of resume exchanges, and I felt like it was reviewed enough at that point where I'd say, okay, more, at least a little bit confident in applying to some the internships and positions. But other than that, I think everything else I felt, very much less than confident on. I know for a fact when I was reaching out to bankers, or at least shooting people a message on, Handshake, a lot of them were like, like, we're already interviewing people for the first round. Come back to me like later in the summer, or like in fall recruiting, when things maybe kick back up again, right? Like when we're back on campus, just because at that point, it's really weird where a lot of the times your end of your sophomore year, they really focus on recruiting. Then they might hit a pause on that, and you come back kind of on your fall semester or late summer, and recruiting picks really back up again. So I think at that point when I was reaching out, they're like, everything's great, but feel free to shoot me an email or a message later on. So I really wasn't getting any interviews or really ahead on anything, but more so kind of like, hey, great to keep in touch, just message me later, or obviously sometimes just not even hear back at all. So I think that was like a big, I felt like hitting a wall there, and I really wasn't progressing far. I think this was come around May, June, when, I was getting all these messages or just non-replies. So I think that was a really big challenge for me back then.
Right. Okay. So then networking was a bit of a struggle. And then, like, in terms of interview prep, how were you going about that? Like, what resources were you using prior to Wall Street Mastermind? Probably, I'm guessing a lot of the same resources that everybody's using, especially at a school like Penn, right? But like, what were you doing specifically?
Yeah, honestly, at that point, interviews were, unfortunately not a big priority for me at all. I was just, I was, and I learned this later on, like, from my mistakes, obviously. But at that point, I was like, let me at least get in contact with someone. Let me at least get like a first round or something, right? So if I'm being really candid, at that point, I really wasn't focusing on interviews too much. Maybe just brushing up on my technicals. I remember, I took an accounting class that semester. I said, hey, let me just review a couple of maybe just high level concepts. But I, at that point, kind of felt confident, like even if I did get a first round, because I just took an accounting class and I just took my finance 101 class at Penn, I thought maybe I'll be fine for that at the very least. So I wouldn't say I wasn't really prepping for interviews at that point, besides like the occasional brushing over some accounting concepts, or maybe looking at like a guide and just like breezing through it. So I really was not focused on interview prep at that point.
Got it. Okay. So I think the first time we talked, or the first time, I don't know how you found us initially, actually, but I think the first time we talked was like maybe in early August or something like that of your, I think it was the summer between your sophomore and your junior year, right? You didn't join the program right away though. And then eventually, I think when you did join, it was maybe like, I want to say 2 months later in like mid-October, like your junior year has started. And so walk us through, because I think a lot of people are in a similar shoes as you, where maybe they talk to us initially and they're not really sure about whether this is something they want to do or not. And so, like, walk us through kind of like that thought process of like, what were you kind of skeptical about the first time? Or maybe it's not skepticism, I don't know, whatever it is, right? But you could be totally candid, like, what held you back? And then what eventually made you come back, like, 2 months later and say, hey, maybe this is something that I want to try. Like, what was that thought process like?
Sure. I think so. I think you're right. You hit it spot on. I think it was around August I initially reached out. And I remember finding Wall Street Mastermind. I think it was like an ad on Facebook or something like that. And I just was really curious, wanted to read about you guys a little bit. But then that was around then I set up the kind of initial call with you, Sam. And I remember we talked a little bit. And I guess for me at that point, I just wanted to get a sense of what this community is like and what maybe kind of services you offer. At very first, I was like, okay, this sounds great. But to me, I felt like maybe this is just going to be a lot of, additional work or just like an extra class. And I really wanted to kind of gear myself towards like, okay, this is great and all, but I think I can probably manage on my own, right? I think I can interview prep a little bit on my own. So I want to say like the best word I can probably use for this is like I felt a little overly confident in myself and thinking that I could probably do this on my own, right? Come September, when on-campus recruiting, I remember started and I was, submitting my resumes. And I remember I was, it was really exciting because I was getting a lot of first rounds. I was getting a lot of callbacks. People kind of reaching out to me, and HR people were also reaching out to me. So I was like, this is great, So I was always worried out throughout the summer, but now it seems like everything is, more or less turning out to be right. And then, mid-September rolls around, late September, first rounds I thought went great, but then I realized I'm not really getting too many, super day callbacks or too many, second rounds or anything like that. So it seems like my resume is good enough and, maybe I networked a little bit, people remember my name, but I wasn't really getting past like that first round initially, right? And I think by then I realized like, maybe it really is in my interview prep or my style of approaching things that is really lacking. And so that's when I think end of September, I reached out back to you guys and really, explain my situation. Like, yes, I have these first rounds coming. I think my resume is great, but what do you think really is my problem in the sense that I'm not really getting any super days? Or I remember if I got like one or two, like, dead silence, wouldn't really hear back. So I was, really concerned and really worried. And I remember like at that point, I've realized like it really was down to my interview prep. So I think we met up in the call and Sam, you're really candid about it. Like, you might seem confident in it, but, a lot of the times like your technicals were a little off or you didn't feel really confident in your answers. Remember that first phone call, we kind of fleshed it out a little bit. And I realized like, there are clear problems and just, things that I'm not confident about in the way I approach my answers and questions in interviews. So I think at that point I was like, this might be a really great service for me. And this is something that I can, really, really use as a guide to really help me break into IB.
Got it. So essentially, until you've gone through the process, it's easy to feel a bit overconfident about, or like just what it actually takes to get past these interviews. But once by the time the second time came around and you came back, you had already gone through what, maybe like 7 or 8 interviews at that point with like
Mhm.
various bulge bracket and elite boutique and middle market firms, right?
Exactly.
Um, and I think if I remember correctly, some of them you didn't get past the first round. I think maybe for like 2 or 3 of them, you actually even got to the super day.
Mhm.
And I think I remember that conversation. You said for like maybe 3 of them, you actually felt very confident afterwards
Mhm.
coming out of the interview, but then you didn't get the offer,
Yep.
which was kind of like baffling to you, right? And we see that so often, like just students that feel good coming out of the interview and they don't get the offer and they don't know what they're doing wrong or like what else they could be doing
Mhm.
differently, right? um, and I think that's a big challenge for a lot of people, because I think when you're going through the process for the first time, you don't have the benefit of hindsight,
Mhm.
right? And also, you don't have the, obviously, you're doing your best. You're putting your best foot forward in terms of how you answer the behavioral questions, how you answer the technical questions. You've taught yourself everything. You've read all the interview guides. You memorized the answers. Right? You're doing all the things you're supposed to do. But if you if you're making some sort of mistake, or and this is on the technical side certainly true, but even more so on the behavioral side, where if you're saying something in your stories or in your answers that maybe isn't necessarily resonating with the bankers, they're not inclined to, or not they're not inclined, they don't give you feedback,
Mhm.
right? In fact, a lot of firms have policies where their policy is to not give feedback to the candidates, right? Just because they don't want to get into any legal trouble or whatever for why they chose one person over the other. And so you're basically in the dark. Like if there is a mistake that you're making, you're not doing it on purpose. You're making that mistake because you're not able to see the mistake, right? Like it's in your blind spot. And so for those types of things, it's going to be hard to identify it unless you have someone who's more experienced telling you about it, right? By more experience, what I mean, like maybe ideally it's someone that's interviewed a lot of candidates for banking before, right? Or been an actual interviewer at these places where they know this is what the bankers actually want to hear, right? Um, that's one, right? The other thing is like, ideally, it's someone that only knows what the bankers want to hear, but also knows how a lot of your competition out there is answering these questions, because then they have this sample size of data that they can benchmark your performance against, and to be able to like more scientifically tell you, hey, like, out of 10 students, like you probably, better than 9 of them, or maybe you're only better than 5 of them, or whatever it is. Like a lot of times I feel like candidates are so like focused on just what they're doing, but there's not really a good way to figure out what everyone else is doing, right? Like, I mean, sure, you can probably go and talk to your friends who are going through the banking recruiting process. You can talk to some upperclassmen that went through the process last year, and you can ask them like, oh, like, what did you say for this answer or whatever. But it's very anecdotal, and it's very it's kind of spotty, right? It's not a good sample. And so that's the piece that a lot of times is missing, is like, okay, for you to, I mean, I think for you at least, you kind of realized early on enough that, hey, something's not working.
Mm-hmm.
I need to make changes.
Mm-hmm.
And then you came in October, and I don't remember how long it took you to like actually sign the offer, but I think it was definitely getting close, right? It was like getting towards the tail end of the recruiting process at that point. By the time you signed, you were probably getting a little bit nervous, if I had to guess, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for most people, what we recommend is like, come in earlier, right? Even if you haven't gone through the process yet, because imagine if you have fixed all the things that we identified the first time around, and then you went through those same 7 or 8 interviews, you probably would have gotten a different outcome for at least some of them, right? And then the way that, I don't know, like most people, they like when we talk to students, a lot of students say, oh, I want to work for an elite boutique, or I want to work for a bulge bracket bank or whatever, right? And those banks typically recruit the earliest, right? So usually like for people that come back later, it's after they've already taken their shot with the elite boutiques and the bulge bracket banks. And then if they don't work out, we can still help them. But now we're looking at maybe like the middle market banks, right? And if you come back even later than that, maybe we're looking at the regional boutique banks. Just like the longer you wait, the less opportunity remains, right? And that's the only thing. It's just like there's two ways to approach it. One is like, yeah, chance it, DIY it, see if you can make it happen. And if you can make it happen, great. Of course, then hindsight's always 2020. But if you can't make it happen, then would you care if you had to go from a bulge bracket or elite boutique down to a middle market? Or would you care if you had to go from a middle market down to a regional boutique? Like, does that's the risk reward trade-off that you're making, right? When you're making a decision. If you could go back and redo it, like, would you still kind of like go about the way that you did it, or would you say you probably would have started earlier? Again, of course, hindsight is 2020, but just knowing what you know now, like how do you think you would have approached this?
I think for sure I would have started earlier, and probably even more importantly, I think would have been just at the very least, narrowing down my focus a little bit, because I think my problem really, and besides like the whole timeline wise, right, and kind of starting a little bit late, but I think it's also worth mentioning the problem for that was the fact that I didn't narrow myself or tell myself this, really early on, that I want to do investment banking. This will be my sole focus, right? And I think because of that, my timeline was pushed. Like I mentioned briefly in my introduction, I was still unsure. Like, I see, 50 or 60% of people at Penn going to investment banking. That's a lot, but then there's also a lot of people going to other, great fields. So I was very much like all over the place, and I think that if I were to go back, besides a timeline, even more importantly, I think I would probably, tell myself, like, if you're going to do invest in banking, like, put that as your sole focus, put everything aside, and really be able to focus on it, right? And this applies to everything. If you're not giving 100% into anything in life or half-assing things, you're not going to get really far, or you might get far enough, but it's not going to, be successful or meaningful for you in the long term. So I think more importantly, I would have told myself to narrow down my focus, sort out my priorities, and that would hopefully have helped with the whole like timeline issue, I think. So yeah.
And that's a great point. And I think, and that piece is tough, right? Because the banks aren't really doing you guys any favors because they keep moving the recruiting timeline up early and early and early and early. Like back in my days, we didn't have to recruit for a junior summer internship until junior year, right? Nowadays, you have to recruit for a junior summer internship, second semester, sophomore year.
Yep.
And then who knows what's going to happen, going forward. Pretty soon they'll probably start recruiting out of high school. I don't know, but but it's tough because a lot of you come into college and you don't know what you want to do yet. You just turned 18, right? Like, how are you supposed to know? But unfortunately, like, we don't make the rules. It just is what it is. I absolutely agree that you should do everything you can. Like maybe that first semester in college, figuring out like what direction you want to go in, right? Like maybe join a variety of different clubs and kind of like get a taste of everything and seeing what direction you want to go in. Maybe take on some internships and try it out and see if it's for you, right? Like whatever it is you got to do, like start networking, start talking to people in different industries, start talking to different alumni, just kind of get the lay of the land, and then like pick something that you think is the most likely to be the thing that you don't have to know for certain. Like this is not like a irreversible decision where if you say, hey, I'm going to go here now, I'm not going to be able to come back later and change my mind, especially if you're talking about something like banking, where the beauty of banking is that if you try banking, whether it's a summer internship or even if you try banking for full time and you do banking for a year or two as an analyst and you decide that banking is not for you, guess what? The beauty of banking is that you have the flexibility to go into a bunch of other things, right? Like you having that banking experience on your resume, it's like the halo effect of other employers see that, oh, wow, this person got into investment banking. It's very selective. He's probably, very qualified because only very qualified people get in. I know he can work hard. He probably work 80, 90, 100 hours a week. So what employer doesn't like hiring people like that, right? And so you actually like one of the biggest reasons why I decided to go into banking was actually because I didn't know what I wanted to do in the long term for my career. But I was like, this allows me to at least buy myself more time. I can kick the can down the road for another year or two while I figure it out. And during that time, I'm going to learn a bunch. I'm going to meet a lot of really smart people, build up my network. I'm going to make good money while I'm doing it, which is always a nice thing, on a nice bonus on the side, right? Maybe pay off some of those student loans, which I had a good amount of student loans coming out. And then I can decide what I want to do later on, right? And maybe I do love banking. I want to stay in banking, then that's great too. And if I don't, I want to go to private equity. I want to go to hedge fund. I want to go to VC. I want to go into tech. Whatever it is that you want to do, you always have those options available to you, right? So optionality, I think, is like super important, right? Especially when it comes to careers. Like you want to have a choice. You want to have the freedom to do the things that you want to do, right? And I think banking, a lot of times, will provide you with that, right? So in terms of like your time in Wall Street Mastermind, then I think like the biggest focus for you was really on the technical side of things, right? If I remember correctly, like that was the part that you really needed help with the most. So can we maybe just spend a couple minutes talking about like how you went about the technical prep after you joined Wall Street Mastermind? Like, what's the difference? Because we get this question all the times, like, what's really different about how you guys teach technicals versus what I could already do on my own, or versus me just reading some interview guides? Like, all the technical knowledge that you need is theoretically already online. It's already on Google. You could probably just, go watch a bunch of YouTube videos, right? Like, what is the difference still? Like, why do you think was it more effective, first of all? And if so, like, why was it more effective?
Yeah. So it definitely was, more effective. And I think, to just put simply, before I kind of delve into this, it really is a matter of rote memorization versus understanding. And I think, coming into it, like I explained before, just brushing up on those guides, right? Like breaking into Wall Street guides and even the Wall Street races that, legit everyone has access to. It's a simple Google search away. Having those big guides for me at the very beginning was sitting down and just memorizing, right? Just like I would memorize my SAT words when I was preparing for the SAT. Same thing here, sitting down, just memorizing a question and its answer, and maybe like looking at key vocabulary words and thinking, okay, when someone asks me this, I'm going to refer to this, or I'm going to have this answer prepared or remotely memorized. And obviously that really wasn't working, right? Especially as I know, as a lot of people have seen, interviewers know this these days, and they're getting really crafty in the way they sometimes answer, give you questions. So they might start off with a basic, an accounting question or a basic finance question, and they'll see, okay, he knows this, or they know their stuff. But then right away they might start with follow-up questions, or they'll have certain nuances that they're adding to their questions that you might not really see in these guides. And I noticed this right away, especially in my super days, where I might have felt a little bit confident at first, but then I realized, oh, but I might have screwed something up, or I might have not said, what they were looking for, or said something. And I think that with Wall Street Mastermind, a big thing was, first of all, going through those modules, right? There was a bunch, and really just understanding those concepts, right? So it was pretty much like, yes, I had all that stuff memorized, but I was honestly kind of starting from scratch at that point, because like I wanted to get a sense of like, okay, like, but how exactly does this concept maybe apply in this situation? Or if you tweak the situation just a little bit, or had like a different kind of vocabulary word, how does that change the situation? So with Wall Street Mastermind, it really was down to just being able to understand these concepts and be able to kind of answer questions that were phrased maybe a little bit differently, that before joining I maybe struggled with, or I might have not even thought about it and just answered the way the guides taught me, or from reading the guides, and that might have not really caught the attention of a banker or passed me on to the next round. So I think, to just like I said, to put it simply, it was down to rote memorization versus with Wall Street Mastermind, be able to understand the concepts and be more confident in answering a lot of those technical questions.
Got it. That makes sense. So, like, if I were to play devil's advocate for a second, like, so obviously understand that rote memorization is not going to work nowadays because they're not going to just ask you the question that you've already memorized from the guides. Like, they've seen those questions, right? They know everyone's reading it. From a conceptual understanding level, though, like, I mean, how does Wall Street Mastermind make it easier to understand? Like, versus like, I could read a guide
Mhm,
and it'll explain to me like what a DCF is, for
mhm.
example,
Yeah.
right? Isn't that enough for me to kind of understand the concepts just by doing that, or like how is it any different than what I would already be doing?
Yeah, I think that's like, to answer that, like it's more like twofold. So for starters, I felt that like watching the modules, but then there were the components where I think personally for me, what I found the most helpful is actually the mock interviews that Wall Street Mastermind hosted, because they not only like covered a lot of the questions that the guides did, but they might have twisted the questions just a little bit, and gave you different scenarios where maybe like a DCF question, like you just said, Sam, but maybe with like a little bit of a twist, or something a little bit more specific that you probably wouldn't have known just from reading the guide. So I think for starters, that was for me the most kind of unique thing and what I found the most helpful. The other really being, I maybe have had a super day, or have had friends that were had questions, and I may reach out to a friend, hey, I heard you had like so and so super day just now. Maybe if what are maybe just like some of the typical questions you were asked. And I know that I always had Wall Street Mastermind as a resource, just reaching out to, Sam directly and asking like, how would I best approach this? Or like, what would you advise would be like the best way? Which, obviously you can't really ask a guide or the writers of the guides to really, give you that kind of guidance. So I think that was the second part that was the most helpful to me, where I might have had seen a question in a super day, or like, hey, Sam, how could I have answered this better? What would you have answered in this case? And I think that was, extremely helpful because it was very personable. It was, personable to my situation, to the questions that I was given, and I was able to just ask this as a resource. And even during, like, say, like the office hours, right? Like, if I know a lot of people have found those helpful at Wall Street Mastermind, but just asking these questions at office hours and getting the kind of answers that they want to hear, that's also a very helpful resource. So I think those are some of the things that I found most helpful, and something that the guides or even just like YouTube videos online would certainly not help me with.
So the biggest, if I were to really sum up everything you said, and there's a lot of good stuff there, it's like the human element, it's the personalized aspect, it's the it's the difference between having someone there to personally coach you through whatever it is you need help with and answer any questions you have anytime you have them, versus you just trying to read a book or teach yourself everything. Like the analogy I usually make is like, when you go to Penn, you can either go to lecture, learn from your professor, go to your small section and ask questions to your TA, and interact with your classmates and stuff like that. Versus, you could also theoretically buy a textbook and stay in your dorm and just read the textbook on your own the whole semester, and you're probably going to get different results, right? You're probably going to learn better in the first way as opposed to the second way. Although for some reason, when it comes to interview prep, a lot of people are opting for the second way when it's less effective and less efficient, right? I think the other challenge too, honestly, is that going back to what we said way back when we first started this conversation, a lot of times you don't know what you don't know. Like, you might think that you know the answer, whether it's a technical answer or behavioral answers, and then you think you're good, and then you just move on to the other things when your answer could actually still be better. And if you don't have someone else pointing that out for you or identifying those things for you and giving you the feedback, and you mentioned the mock interviews, half of our mock interviews grilling you, but the other half is really us giving you detailed feedback. That's the part that's missing a lot of the times, right? And like, yeah, you can do a mock interview with maybe your friend or your upperclassman or whatever, but those friends or those upperclassmen, they're just going through the process just like you are, or they've gone through the process one time. Maybe they're one step ahead of you, right? But they haven't been an interviewer. They haven't been a banker. They don't know what the bankers are looking for. And so the quality of the feedback that you can receive from a student only goes so far, right? It's like you go to med school and you're trying to become a doctor. You want to be a heart surgeon, or neurosurgeon. Do you want to learn how to operate from someone that's done, hundreds of operations before and is super, experienced? Or do you want to maybe learn how to operate from the guy that's in residency a year above you, right? Or if you're the patient, who would you want to operate on you, right? It's kind of the same thing. So it's like, for something as important as your career, who do you want to put that in the hands of, right? Because for most of you, you're only going to have one shot at getting this summer internship, which is then going to largely determine where you end up for full-time, right? And so you just want to make sure, I always tell people, like, make your one shot your best shot, because that's all you got, right? So that's really insightful. So thanks for sharing that. So I guess, like, if we fast forward to kind of like the end of your recruiting process, like, ultimately, what was the outcome in the end, and like, what happened?
Yeah. So I ended up getting, an offer that I was, pretty content with. And like I said before, a lot of it was, definitely thanks to just the Wall Street Mastermind program and just the guidance that I got from it. And I think even more so, I think it prepped me just in general about the way I approach recruiting, like I said before, in general, but also, interview for full time, right? So kind of going through, the summer process was great, but I think it even more so prepared me for full time, because now having a better understanding of these concepts and having a better understanding of the way, I'm asking my questions. And I think a lot of the other thing was, helping with behaviorals as well, which I know we didn't really talk about too much, but I just wanted to bring that up briefly. With that behavioral aspect was also something that I thought I was really confident on, but being able to pitch that story and in the very beginning to tell people, exactly what they want to hear in those like 3 or 4 minutes that you have is, extremely crucial, and it sets the tone for the rest of the interview. And I think having that guidance and having a lot of that help through the Wall Street Mastermind program also helped me for full time, and I was able to kind of more quickly think about about telling my story, about how I'm crafting my questions to the interviewers at the end, for example. But even more so, like we were talking about the technicals, right? And being able to just actually understand these concepts and not be afraid of like a little bit of a twist or a little bit of a tricky question, because I'm already fully prepared and I went through this in summer internship recruiting. So I think, just to sum up, I think it was great to have this during my summer, because it really full on prepared me, I think, for full time and be able to kind of think about things a little bit more logically and coherently.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you brought up a good point there, which is obviously you were late to the junior summer internship recruiting process, and then so obviously you did the internship, you got the offer to go back, but you always have the opportunity to recruit again for full time if you want to do that, right? And so for you personally, you were able to leverage your summer internship offer into an even better offer for full time, which now you're gonna be going to very reputable middle market bank, right?
Exactly.
Uh, and is that a like, how do you feel about that outcome? Like, is that an outcome that you're pretty happy with, or?
Yeah, no, I'm really happy with it for sure. I think going through an intensive summer internship process, and obviously this year very very different with it being all virtual, and a lot of people joke and say like, oh, it must be so easy for you. You just have to like put on the top of your student stuff. But I would wholeheartedly disagree and say it actually was much more of a challenge. Just because like you're not really interfacing with people, and the people element is gone completely. You're just it's just you, the video screen, and your face. So I think that posed a much bigger challenge. So I want to say like my full-time recruiting was probably even more intense than my summer internship recruiting, but really really happy with my end results. The other thing was my just to disclosure, but my summer internship offer was in a different city, not like in my hometown, in New York, and I really wanted to be in New York for full time for sure. That was just something that I thought about, like my summer internship, like it's great, but I realized that I definitely want to be in the city with all the opportunities and just setting me up for potential future success. So the other thing was just a big location change, which might not seem like a big deal, but just going through the full time recruiting process, and because there's so much more competition for New York. I was definitely well more prepared for it, and definitely much more confident about it as well. So hopefully that answers your question, Sam.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that where you're going to live after you graduate, I mean, it matters a lot. It affects your lifestyle tremendously, right? And especially if you're from New York originally, your family's all in New York, and obviously that's kind of like where all the action is. It's the financial capital of the world, right? And so totally makes sense that you would want to be there, and that's not something to discount, right? And you make a good point, which is full-time recruiting, New York or not, regardless, just full-time recruiting in general is a lot more competitive, right? Because there's fewer jobs, right? A lot of the offers have already been given to the summer interns that are coming back, and so you're fighting for the last, one or two openings that are available in any given group, if there's even any jobs available at all. But if there is, it's usually one or two jobs, and you're also at that point probably competing with candidates that are much more prepared and much more qualified, because they've also done a summer internship elsewhere at some other bank, right? And so it's just tougher all around. And so the fact that you were able to get such a great offer for full time, I mean, it's quite the accomplishment. So huge props to you on that. So look, guys, like I think last question I have for Evan here is just like, if you had just one piece of advice for our listeners who are listening right now, maybe people who are where you were a year and a half ago, they're just starting to go through the recruiting process right now, or maybe even earlier, right? What's something that you wish that someone had told you way back when you first started that you think would have, helped you tremendously, or saved you a lot of time or effort or whatever it may be? Just like what's the best piece of advice that you have for people?
Oh, that's a great question. So much I could say, but if I have to pick, like, just no, honestly, but if I have to pick one, thing, and kind of to veer away from like the more cliche kind of advice with like timing and stuff like that. I mean, those are pretty self-explanatory. But for me, I would have really liked for someone to just tell me to, honestly, don't overthink things, right? And don't be confident about it, but at the same time, you have to be able to just go with the flow, right? Just because like you didn't, receive a response from somewhere, or weren't called back for, a super day or a second round or whatever the case may be. Think of, maybe just think about what you might have done wrong, but honestly, start focusing on other things. You might have another super day in a couple of days. You might have another interview, tomorrow. Phone interview or not, you still want to be as confident prepared for that. So don't let something like, a small minor setback like that overshine another, really great moment or a really great opportunity that you might not get again. And that also applies honestly for just, I think the Wall Street Mastermind program. Like I said, my situation was probably like most people where I might have, met initially or with a Sam or a member of the team, or at least had a good understanding of what Wall Street Mastermind does. But I ended up holding off for about a month or two until I actually officially joined the program, when I realized my overconfidence was like stepping up a little bit. And I think also that advice, like I said before, applies as well. So, don't overthink it. If you feel like you're struggling, if you feel like you've really, a program like Wall Street Mastermind might help you get that opportunity or might help you really break into, a very, very competitive field like IB, go for it. Don't really give it a second thought. It really is your career on the line, and, not to sound dramatic, but it would help you, it really helps with success later down the line. And, at the very least, will definitely set you up for summer internship, or if you're even in the full-time recruiting phase, it'll give you the foundation you need and it'll give you the skills. So, just overall, don't overthink things, and be a little bit more confident in yourself and in the way you make decisions. I think that's like the biggest advice that I can honestly give to people.
That's great advice. I think if I were to like just sum that up in one word, it's just like being decisive, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times people say, I want to think about this, and they are on the fence and they overthink a lot of things. And honestly, like a lot of times, like just even by doing that, you end up making a worse decision because you're
Yeah.
doubting yourself, right? Versus if you were just decisive about it, you trust your gut, you feel like this is something that's going to help you, and you run with it. I mean, you got to do your research. I'm not saying don't do your research. There's plenty of information out there about Wall Street Mastermind or anything else that you want to look into, right? You got to do your research, and then like whatever the evidence is, make your assessment on what you think about it. Form your own opinion, right? Don't necessarily listen to what other people have to say. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, let me ask this person, let me ask that person, or this or that." It's like, no, it's your career, right? Anyone who's giving you advice ultimately won't be responsible for what happens to you, right? They won't be responsible for whether you get in or not. You're ultimately going to be the one that's responsible. You're the one that's going to live with it. And so form your own opinions about the evidence that's in front of you, and then trust your gut.
Mhm.
Right? Trust what your gut tells you, and be decisive and take action, so that you're not, stalling out or losing time. Because again, when it comes to investment banking recruiting, the more time that passes, the worse your options are going to be, right? All the best banks, they kind of get filled up first, and then at that point, the decision's been made for you. It's not even like whether you want to work for them or not. Like it's just not available,
Yep.
right? And so I think that's a great advice, Evan. Thank you for sharing that. On that note, for any of you that are, thinking about getting into banking, or you're already currently going through the process, I know that summer internship recruiting for summer 2022 is right around the corner. If you guys are gearing up for that right now and you're not 100% confident, and you feel like you could use the extra help, I want to encourage you to reach out to us. You can schedule a call with us at www.wallstreetmastermind.com/apply. The street is abbreviated to ST, so it's www.wallstmastermind.com/apply. And what will happen is, you can pick the time that works best for you. We'll hop on. We'll ask you about how things are going. We want to learn more about your goals. What kind of banks are you trying to get into? We want to talk about any challenges that you feel like you're currently having and you need help with. And then if we feel like we can actually help you with those things, we're happy to walk you through what we think that might look like or how we would do that. Sometimes we might talk to you and we might not be the best fit to help you, honestly. And in which case, I will actually tell you that we're not the best fit, and we'll just give you some advice instead on what we think you should do or what we would do if we were you. Okay. So either way, I want to make sure that you walk away with some value on the strategy session. But if you want to do that, go and book that call. We look forward to talking to you. And Evan, thank you again for taking the time to jump on this call with us today and sharing your experiences. I'm sure all of our listeners found it to be hugely beneficial, and I'm super excited for you for the job that you're about to start coming up in this next year, and look forward to all the success that you're going to have, and just obviously keeping tabs on what you're going to do going forward. And I'm sure we're going to continue to talk and stay in touch. So just don't be a stranger.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Sam. Appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, absolutely, man. All right, guys, that'll be it for today. And thank you guys for tuning in. And we'll be back with more of these in the future. All right. Bye.